Well, hi everyone. My name's Daniel Williams, Senior Editor at MGMA. Welcome to today's webinar, Cracking the Clinician Code, Insights to Attract and Retain Top Talent Today. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy New Year in 2026. We would like to thank locumtenens.com for their sponsorship. Locumtenens.com provides innovative staffing solutions for healthcare clients experiencing gaps in their care continuum. Their website has a variety of digital resources for hospitals and medical practices, and their experienced associates are available to collaborate on customized approaches to solve any workforce challenge. Please see the slide for available credits for the live and on-demand experiences. To claim all credit types, you must complete the session evaluation following the webinar. Now, we highly encourage interactivity in our digital events, so please use the chat button to talk to your fellow attendees and look for that Q&A button to ask questions of the presenter. Any additional resources can be found in the Learning Management System. You can also access those during the webinar by clicking on the Resources button in this Zoom room. The education for this session will now begin. In today's webinar, Allison Sawyer of locumtenens.com will share key insights from the company's 2025 survey conducted in collaboration with Advisory Board, offering practical data and strategies to help you improve recruitment, boost retention, and keep your practice strong in a rapidly changing workforce landscape. Allison, I know you've got a lot of great information, so I'm going to turn this over to you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Daniel. And thank you to MGMA for allowing us to host this event today. We hope this is going to provide some valuable information for all of you on just some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the physician workforce space right now. As Daniel mentioned, my name is Allison Sawyer, and I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at locumtenens.com. I've had the privilege of being with locumtenens.com, or what you'll hear me call LT for the remainder of the conversation, for about 5 years. Leading corporate strategy, customer experience, and our major corporate initiatives. We're really excited to share with you all the outcomes of what has been a significant research effort in partnership with the Advisory Board company. And when we started this project about a year ago, our intention was really focused on trying to gather insights directly from clinicians about their perceptions of today's job market, really drilling in on what they're looking for, what matters most to them, and how their preferences are evolving in an ever-changing job market. I think this is probably no surprise to anyone on this call, but we are in the midst of what I would call the healthcare industry's greatest and most profound workforce shortage in the history of the US. And it's really with that reality in mind that we felt understanding the needs, the motivations, the expectations of clinicians was more critical than ever. In particular, for healthcare organizations, we believe that aligning your recruiting strategies with some of the insights that were uncovered in this research effort will not only be beneficial, but essential in maintaining a competitive edge in today's environment. So our hope is that today's session will equip you with some valuable information to really attract and retain top clinical talent in today's market. And I welcome questions at the end of today's session on anything that we present and share today. So digging in, there are a couple of areas that I'm going to cover just throughout the course of today's presentation. First and foremost, I'm going to share with you some of the initial findings from our research around what we saw in our clinician responses relative to their job preferences and satisfaction in the current market. Second, we're going to spend some time looking at the clinician perspectives on different employment models. Really trying to understand whether there was any nuance or difference in terms of whether a clinician was working 1099 versus W-2, working for independent practices versus corporate-owned organizations, and how that influenced their decisions around where they were going to work. And then finally, we're going to spend some time digging into some of the data and what was revealed just in terms of where clinicians are placing their greatest prioritization as we think about some of the typical things that are included in an organizational strategy around recruitment and retention, areas like compensation, work environment, and work-life balance. Before we jump into the research, just a little bit of information about locumtenens.com. Daniel did, I think, a good job of kind of talking through some of our digital assets. But for those who might be unfamiliar with our organization, we are a staffing agency. In fact, we're one of the largest staffing agencies in the locum tenens space. We've been in business since 1995, so about 30 years. And across all of that time period, we've really had one core mission at the heart of everything that we do, which is empowering uninterrupted, exceptional patient care through the staffing of locum tenens clinicians. Now, in that 30 years, while our mission has remained the same, how we are serving our customers through the provision of staffing and the services that we do offer additive to sort of basic placement has changed. Our organization is now much more involved upstream with customers, supporting the design of care teams, helping you think strategically through care delivery models, how to best leverage advanced practice and MDs, DOs as a mixed care team. We help set up telehealth programs, not only helping organizations design the care workflows for how a telehealth program could be operated, but then also supporting the technology needs and the staffing required to ensure you have the right clinician panels who may be supporting your organization virtually. We also partner with organizations through periods of transition, whether that be standing up a new service line or helping organizations who might be shifting from one program management group to another. Not only, again, helping provide the staff to support them through those transition periods, but really helping them navigate some of the complexities around shift scheduling, managing a dynamic workforce, et cetera. I'll also make a quick plug for some of our technology offerings. We do support clients through the delivery of everything from a scheduling software to float pool management tools, credentialing technology, and we do as well have a vendor management system that we are able to offer clients who are interested in those kinds of capabilities. The last thing I'll say here is that we do partner with organizations for over 150 different medical specialties and subspecialties, which has given us a very broad view of the market and some of the challenges that both clinicians and health systems are facing, which is really what prompted us to begin this research effort with the advisory board. I'll talk a little bit about our partner, the advisory board company, as well. I think they're very well known in the healthcare space, very well respected research leader in healthcare with over 40 years of experience in advising healthcare providers on best practices, really trying to equip leaders with insights, perspectives, experiences that have helped propel the industry forward. They publish a number of different research reports, studies, white papers annually, really all centered on providing healthcare leaders with actionable insights. Little fun fact, I started my career at the advisory board company, so it was a very full circle moment for me to be able to partner with them on this research effort. And I'm really proud of really what we've been able to produce as a result of this research. So before we jump into the research results, a couple background, I think, data points that are helpful context as we think about where we centered some of the questions that we took out to the clinicians who were participating in this survey. As I said before, we're experiencing one of the greatest workforce shortages in the healthcare industry in any recent or long-term history here in the U.S. And there's some exacerbating factors that have really, I think, altered the dynamic of the clinician workforce relative to this. So one thing I'll call out is when we are talking through this research, when I say clinicians throughout this presentation, I am referring to both physicians and advanced practice practitioners. So MDs, DOs, NPs, physicians assistants, and CRNAs were all part of this research effort. But what I think we found when we were kicking this off was that while there were a lot of surveys out in market that were telling us where clinicians were working in terms of the types of employers and where we're starting to see shifts in the market from rural to urban settings, from independent practice to more corporate-owned businesses. There was not a lot of research in existence around why clinicians were choosing to move in some of those directions. And so we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the clinician preferences and how they are perceiving the job market today, to really bring a new perspective to how we are talking about where clinicians want to work. We did feel that this research was timely for the three reasons that you see articulated here on this page. I think first and foremost, clinicians have more options for employment available to them than ever before. Corporate medical groups, which were, I think, fairly new to this realm of healthcare a decade ago, really meaning those that are either owned by insurance plans, private equity firms, even retail employers, are starting to play such a large role in the healthcare environment where they were new about a decade ago. Now we're seeing about a third of physician practices are completely owned by one of these corporate owned entities today. We are also seeing a significant generational shift among the clinician workforce. So a lot of this came by virtue of the pandemic, but many experienced clinicians are retiring or approaching retirement age and preparing to leave the workforce, where younger clinicians, who I think we typically hear have a very different perspective and set of preferences and expectations for how they want to work, are becoming a much larger segment of the overall clinician workforce. And so those are some considerations that we took into our minds as we were coming up with the questions that we wanted to address through this research. Finally, the last piece here, just the evolution of care delivery models. We are seeing many more organizations adopting collaborative team-based approaches in response to the workforce shortage, particularly a sharp rise in the role of advanced practice practitioners. In fact, the data point that we've included here shows that APPs are projected to outnumber primary care physicians in the administration of primary care by 2031, which is only 5 years from now. And I have read some op-ed pieces that have gone as far to say that there is a potential outcome in which primary care is completely facilitated through the work of advanced practice practitioners, and MDs ultimately leave the space. So it was with all of these factors in mind that we set out to understand the impact of not only these shifts, but the overall dynamics that are influencing the market right now, and really drill into, more importantly, what they mean for organizations like yours as you think about how to attract and retain clinical talent in a very competitive market. So we will start digging in on some of the research here. A little bit of background on who participated in this survey. I mentioned before, this was a cross-section of MDs, DOs, advanced practitioners. In total, we had a little over 700 clinicians participate in this research study. And it was fairly evenly split between physicians and advanced practice practitioners. As you can see here on the first pie chart, about 43% APPs, 56% physicians. And we also tried to ensure that we were surveying a cross-section of physicians and APPs working in different practice settings. So I would say majority, about 54% of our respondents currently work in hospital health systems. Next was about 31% in the independent single or multi-specialty practice setting. And then the remainder were either corporate-owned medical group employees or working in sort of a broad other category, which could include everything from startup organizations to non-bedside clinical settings. So there's a lot that could be wrapped up in that cross-section. The last sort of segmentation that I'll kind of point out here is around age distribution. So as I alluded to earlier, I think there is a general perception of the market that suggests that the preferences of clinicians who are older, more tenured in their career, potentially approaching retirement, are different than those of newer clinicians who are just now entering the space, younger demographics, millennial, Gen Z. And so we wanted to ensure that we had a cross-section of clinicians representing all of those different age ranges. So what we did in our response selection and selection of the clinicians that ultimately participated in this survey was tried to ensure that the age distribution of our responses mirrored the age distribution of clinicians in the overall clinical market. So for, let's say, like the millennial category, between 31 and 40 or 41 and 50, that 22% of respondents falling into that category correlates to the percentage of clinicians broadly working in the market that fall into those same age ranges. So we wanted this to be an accurate representation in terms of response based on where the market currently sits in age distribution today. And then that bottom figure, obviously us coming from a locum tenens firm, we're always interested in hearing whether the perceptions of locum tenens clinicians or clinicians who are working 1099 assignments are different than those clinicians who are working in permanent roles or working as W-2 employees. And so we did ensure that there was a cross section here as well, with about 64% of our respondents working as full-time employed clinicians and 36% operating as 1099 independent contractors. So good cross sections across the board, really wanting to dig into some of the segmentation and see what that produced in terms of the research results. All right, so now we're going to start going through what we ultimately saw in the research itself. I'm going to go again through these three categories, so starting with satisfaction and intent to leave. And then we're going to talk about some of the priorities and preferences that clinicians told us rose to the top for them. In terms of their responses. And then the last category is going to focus on where we see certain employers potentially meeting those preference expectations better than others and what that potentially means for you all as you're thinking about your own opportunities to recruit clinicians. All right, so satisfaction and intent to leave. Before I jump into this, I'll give you guys fair warning. I'm probably going to show you a lot of data, a lot of charts across the remainder of today's session. And we wanted to break that up and make this hopefully a little bit more fun and a little bit more engaging and dynamic for the folks who are joining us. So across the rest of today's session, I'm going to show you a couple of different trivia questions. And we'd like to encourage the group to submit what you think the right answer would be. I will tell you this is not a quiz. We're not going to hold you accountable to getting the right answers here. But we want to see, just based on your perception of the market, where do you think you might respond to some of these questions? So as I put these up on the screen, I think Anna's going to put a response tool in the chat. Feel free to take a few seconds, select your answer, and then we'll see where everyone landed. So the first question, are satisfied clinicians loyal to their organization? And when I say loyal, I mean essentially less likely to leave or move to a different job opportunity. So satisfied clinicians are loyal to their organization. True or false? Feel free to go ahead and submit your response. And then we'll take a look at the answers. All right. Thank you, Anne, for closing the poll. So it looks like vast majority, 80% of today's respondents said yes. You believe that satisfied clinicians are loyal to their organization. I'd be curious from the 20% why you thought that might be false. Perhaps you've seen our research report already. This is a little bit of a trick question. So surprisingly, the correlation between satisfaction and intent to stay did not correlate in the way that we also would have anticipated. In fact, there was a decent percentage of those clinicians who were satisfied with their roles, who also indicated that there was a potential intent to leave their organizations within the next 2 years. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Almost taking a step back, one of the things that we were hoping to address through this research was an examination of whether the current clinician market was in fact satisfied with their jobs. I think over the course of the pandemic and in the past couple of years, there has been a number of different research produced around how factors like burnout, the burden of the pandemic itself, administrative burden have impacted overall job satisfaction for clinicians as a whole. And if you look at some of the trending data from really just the past 5 years, we've seen a significant decrease in the number of clinicians who do report job satisfaction. I think what was surprising for us in the response to our survey was that that percentage actually significantly went up over, I think, where the advisory board had surveyed in a year prior. So 76% of the clinicians who did take part in our survey responded that they were currently satisfied in their existing role. And when we dug into the data, really just trying to look at the stratification across age groups, across advanced practice versus physicians, we found that this was fairly consistent across the board. So there were no major outliers here in terms of job satisfaction. What we did see, if you kind of dig a little bit into some of the data here that's stratified by age, is that APPs, or I'm sorry, not by age, but by role, APPs are slightly more satisfied than physicians, about 2 percentage points. And then digging in by age, it does appear that our older clinicians, so those falling into the 61 to 70 category, were rated the highest in terms of job satisfaction within the physician category, but not hugely different than the overall average across the data set. So this was positive news, I think, seeing what percentage of clinicians responded that they are currently satisfied with their jobs, and perhaps an indicator that the general feeling in the market is starting to shift in a more positive way, where clinicians are kind of coming out of the pandemic, pulling their heads up and feeling a little bit more satisfied with current roles. But the kicker in this research is exactly what we were alluding to with that question. Despite satisfaction, even satisfied clinicians are considering leaving their organizations within the next 2 years. And when we tried to dig into this a little bit more, we were really trying to focus on this intent to leave and trying to understand where there might be a higher percentage of clinicians who are expressing intent to leave based on the age and stratification by titles as well. And found that across all of these, again, there were not any significant outliers. This was fairly consistent across the board. The one thing I will point out with regards to the age demographics is that I think there's been a prevailing narrative in the market that millennials and Gen Z are driving higher turnover at organizations, not just in the healthcare setting, but more broadly in the job market in general. I'm sure you've all heard a ton about the Great Resignation and some of the market trends that we were seeing just a few years ago. And what I would say is that this data shows that that is partly true. We do see that they tend to report higher intent to leave than other age cohorts, though not drastically so. But what I think is surprising here is that intent to leave is still high among our older clinicians. So if you look at that 34% that's highlighted in green, more than a third of our clinicians falling in the 51 to 70 categories indicated that they were considering switching jobs in the next 2 years. Not necessarily retiring, but considering a new job placement. And these are our experienced clinicians with well-established panels, so that should be concerning for organizations, just as you're thinking about retention strategy and the cost of replacement for some of those more tenured clinicians. Anecdotally, here at locumtenants.com, when we're talking to our clients, we often hear that the loss of a tenured clinician can create such a brain drain on an organization that it often takes 2, sometimes 3 net new clinicians to replace the value that that tenured clinician provided. So you really want to pay attention to this potential intent to leave indicator, especially among that older subset, because of the value dynamics at play in losing those clinicians. So main things to take away from this portion of the research findings, really what do you do with this? I think the first thing that we would recommend is that you really want to spend some time talking to your clinicians that are currently on staff and understanding what it is that they are looking for from your organization in order to retain them. If you don't have an employer value proposition, and for those who might be unfamiliar with that term, this is really just a statement or document that kind of outlines what it is about your organization that is differentiated in terms of how you are providing an experience to your employees. We would recommend writing one of these and doing it in collaboration with your existing clinicians so that they are bought into what makes your organization unique and what makes your organization a destination employer. One way that you can create these employee value propositions, and something that I would actually recommend everyone attempt to do, is not only conducting interviews, like exit interviews with clinicians who may be departing your organization to dig into why they're choosing to leave, whether it be something that they would have liked to see change about the way that your organization is currently operating, or something that was very appealing about a competitor organization. But also conducting those kinds of interviews, focus groups, surveys, one-on-one conversations with clinicians who appear to have high satisfaction with their current responsibility and current role within your organization. As this data indicates, satisfaction does not directly correlate to intent to leave. And so digging in with even your happiest and most satisfied clinicians is something that is critically important to organizations, and really understanding the motivating factors or the things that make them want to stay with your organization so that you can leverage that as part of your employer value proposition in attracting and bringing new clinicians into your organization. So I would consider conducting those kinds of conversations, really drilling into what it is that makes you unique, so that you have a great pulse check on what matters most to the clinicians working for your organization. All right. So now jumping to our second topic, priorities and preferences. Um, we're going to ask another trivia question. So this one centers on what you think clinicians are prioritizing when they are looking for a job. When clinicians are seeking a new employment opportunity, do you think that they prioritize the same factors, or do you think that there was a high level of variability in terms of what clinicians told us mattered most? True or false? Do we think it was all the same? I'll give you guys a few seconds to answer, and then we'll look at the responses. All right. So even bigger majority of the group said false, that clinicians did not prioritize the same factors when looking for a job. I'm actually going to hit you guys with a second question before we answer whether you guys got that one right or not. When clinicians are looking for a job, what do you think was the single most top priority or top prioritized preference in selecting that new opportunity? Was it compensation, non-compensation benefits, things like insurance, PTO, schedule flexibility, or work-life balance? And you only select one answer here. Okay, and we'll give you a few seconds to answer that one as well. All right. Oh, pretty divided on this one. Okay. Looks like most of the group answered work-life balance, but there was a fair split between schedule flexibility and compensation, with non-compensation benefits coming in last with around 3%. Okay. So very different. All right. Well, let's find out what the clinicians actually told us. So, hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we are not the unique snowflakes that we think we are. As we asked clinicians across all different age demographics, across physicians versus APPs, 1099s versus W-2s, we consistently got the same 5 factors back from every single segment of the clinicians that we surveyed. And they told us the same 5 things were top priorities in terms of what they're looking for in a new job opportunity. And those things were compensation, geographic location, schedule flexibility, work-life balance, and then non-compensation benefits, most commonly in that order. As we did kind of break down into the different segments, there were some slight nuances in the rank order of those things based on who was responding. So comparing physicians to advanced practice practitioners, we did see that schedule flexibility was a little bit higher up the list than geographic location. Same for work-life balance, with then non-compensation benefits coming in the 5th position. What I would say to you all is that while it's somewhat surprising to find that we don't necessarily have different preferences in terms of our unique qualifications as individuals and what we're ultimately seeking, the good news here is that as you're thinking about a recruitment strategy and really trying to tailor and prioritize where you are focusing your efforts as an organization on recruitment and retention, you really don't have to come up with a lot of unique recruiting strategies that are varied based on the type of clinician that you might be working to attract to your organization. So you don't need a different strategy for APPs versus physicians. If you focus on these 5 areas, you're ultimately going to appeal to the broad market in general, which will allow you to effectively prioritize your efforts and bring in whatever type of clinician you're ultimately trying to attract to the organization. I will show you a few more cuts of this data, as we did have a couple more small nuanced variations. So as we look at the responses stratified by age group, again, we still see the same five priorities, I think with two small exceptions. Down on the lower end in terms of age demographics, so the 30 and under crowd, we saw that schedule flexibility was higher up, and we saw that culture actually replaced geographic location in terms of things that they prioritized in their top five. This actually aligns, I think, to some of the market commentary around where younger generations are seeking employment opportunities that are more purpose-driven. And so feeling like they are part of a purpose-driven organization, part of a cultural environment that is centered on purpose, can kind of carry through, I think, in this research finding. On the opposite end of the age demographic spectrum, in our 61 through 70 and 71 and up demographics, we saw that clinical autonomy actually replaced uh, non-compensation benefits. So this also was interesting, but not necessarily surprising, as many of the older clinicians got their start in private practice and I think had sort of ingrained practice patterns at this point in their career where clinical autonomy is the way that they have always practiced and want to continue to practice. And so we did see that surface here, but not in any of the other age ranges. In the split between 1099s and W-2s, just looking at this from the vantage point of employment status, we did see the order shift slightly. Again, same five, but the order shifted on the 1099s where geographic location and schedule flexibility went up, and work-life balance as well. And we saw non-compensation benefits come off. Not surprising, since that is typically not something that is offered to a 1099 clinician as part of their employment package. In most cases, they are providing those kinds of compensation benefits, non-compensation benefits themselves. But we do see that 1099s often want greater independence and autonomy in determining the schedules in which they're working. And working locum tenens assignments, working 1099 assignments gives them the opportunity to do that. So not surprising to see that correlation there. Now, coming back to the second question that we asked on what factors were ranked most important to clinicians as they are selecting new job opportunities, not surprising, compensation was at the very top of the list. So I think when recalling the results of where you all submitted, this actually came in third in terms of what we were thinking, but the reality is, at the end of the day, compensation is king. It's the number one top rated priority, no matter how we sliced the data, whether it was 1099s versus W-2, age demographic, physicians versus APPs, every single category ranked this in the number one position. And I think this is something that we often hear it can be frustrating for employers, because you only have so much flexibility in terms of what you're able to extend compensation to without reaching a breaking point in terms of your budgets or how you're projecting costs for the organization. And so the advice that we typically give organizations here is you don't necessarily want to outcompete your competitors on compensation, but you do have to have an approach to at least have skin in the game or have a seat at the table with clinicians when you are talking about job opportunities and comparing employment opportunities from the perspective of the clinician. So trying to find some level of market parity. You don't want to be in a race to the top end of salary with your competitors, but try to stay somewhere in the same realm. What's interesting here is when we kind of pull compensation to the side and then look at the other benefits that were prioritized by the clinicians, the schedule flexibility, the work-life balance, and the non-compensation benefits. When you look at those three things and how they were prioritized in aggregate, as a whole, they do outweigh compensation as a standalone. And so one of the things that we are advising organizations to potentially take away from this research and this data is that while you're somewhat limited in terms of how you're able to compete on compensation, you can effectively compete in these three other areas and bring something to the table that allows you to have more negotiating power with clinicians in being able to provide them with services, benefits that they want without necessarily having to break the bank on overall salary offerings. So focusing your strategy in these three areas is something that could allow you to be differentiated and more nuanced in your approach to how you are attracting and retaining clinicians. Um, so we're going to jump to one more question in this category. This was around how clinicians prefer to work. So one of the hypotheses that we had in this research was that clinicians may want to work part-time or reduce their hours in pursuit of work-life balance and in pursuit of schedule flexibility. So true or false, do you think our clinicians told us that they want to work part-time and reduce hours? I'll give you guys, again, a few seconds to answer, and then we'll show the results. Ooh, this is almost an even split. So 57% of the group said false. Clinicians did not want to reduce hours or go part-time. And then 43% of you said true, think they do. All right, so let's see what they said. The answer was false. So clinicians don't want to work less, at least not the ones that participated in this research effort. We were a little surprised by this. We thought that there would be interest in having reduced hours, and we thought that this may go hand in hand with some of the trends that we saw around schedule flexibility. But surprisingly, what we found in the responses was that when we asked the question, what kind of work do the clinicians want to do? The vast majority of them responded with full-time, fixed schedules. So they wanted consistent hours. But when we compared that to the flexibility question, the vast majority told us that they wanted flexible scheduling. So how do these two things come together? Clinicians want to work full time. They want to have a guaranteed number of hours, but they want to have more autonomy and flexibility in when those hours are being placed on the schedule. And when we dug into work-life balance and really trying to understand what this implied from more of the perspective of how clinicians are hoping to balance their time at work with their time at home, there were 5 priorities that came up in the research around adequate time for family commitments, flexible scheduling opportunities. So again, being able to pick the shifts that they want to work, paid time off, and having sort of dedicated, carved out time to be away from their clinical duties. Coverage when taking time off, so feeling comfortable that they're able to step away and that everything is going to be effectively covered without presenting a different challenge when they come back into the clinical setting. And then adequate time for rest and relaxation. And this doesn't necessarily mean time off. This could be additional breaks or just carve out time throughout the course of a given day to ensure that they are being given moments for restful activity away from clinical practice. So I think the big message here was it's not as important to clinicians to reduce how much they work, but rather when they work within the organization. One other thing that we did dig into as we were looking at this data was trying to understand, okay, if clinicians aren't looking to work less, what percentage of them are actually looking for opportunities to work more? And so we asked the question around whether clinicians were working second jobs. And I'll caveat this by saying we know that 1099 clinicians are often taking multiple assignments, working multiple jobs just by virtue of being a 1099. So this question was asked to the clinicians who are working as W-2s only. So clinicians that had a full-time employer in their current career. Of those clinicians who are currently working as W-2s, more than a third of them, so 36%, reported that they are working a second job. Majority of them are working as 1099 contractors, so about 75% of those 36% are working locum tenens. Some of the others are working in more non-bedside types of opportunities, maybe serving as an advisor to a startup organization, maybe doing research consulting, things like that. But when we asked them what was the motivating factor for being willing to take on a second job opportunity, not surprisingly, compensation came to the top of the list again. So financial reasons, seeking additional compensation through that second job opportunity. Second was schedule flexibility. So if I'm able to work my W-2, but then pick up shifts that kind of meet my expectations around when I want to work additive to that, that was an appealing factor for clinicians when considering the willingness to take on a second job opportunity. And then some of the other areas were really just around personal interest or passion. Maybe that was something that gave them an opportunity to do something that they weren't getting necessarily in their day job. Skill diversification, again, like building new talents and traits as part of their development, and then professional development, maybe learning something beyond sort of the current scope of their role. So we thought this was interesting. Not only do clinicians not want to work less, many of them are choosing to work more outside of their day-to-day. So just summarizing this portion of the research, I think the big message here again is when you are thinking about the factors that you need to prioritize in creating your employer value proposition, in putting your prioritization towards different aspects of how you're attracting and retaining clinicians, compensation, you have to be at the table. It's table stakes. You've got to meet the market and at least try to reach a level of parity in terms of what you're able to offer clinicians from a salary perspective. But if you are looking for opportunities to differentiate, compensation is not likely going to be the place where you are able to do so. Instead, focus your recruiting and retention efforts on those other three areas that we discussed: schedule flexibility, work-life balance, and benefits. Those are the areas where you have the greatest opportunity to truly set yourself apart from competitors and bring more to the table in terms of how you're able to negotiate a total package for a clinician to make your organization more appealing as a destination employer. Right. Moving into our last section around employer strengths and weaknesses. Again, in this section, we were really trying to understand, based on the employer type, whether there were any employers that were truly differentiated or doing this better than others. And so we asked clinicians based on where they're working a variety of different questions, and we'll ask you all, I think, our final poll of today. In the responses that we received, do you believe that clinicians told us the best employer to work for was hospitals and health systems, independent practices, corporate-owned medical groups, or none of the above? And again, we'll give you a few seconds to answer. Okay. All right, so this one was a little bit split again. It looks like about half of the group said independent practice, 35% of the group said hospitals and health systems next, and then corporate-owned medical groups around 8, and none of the above around 7. All right, so let's see where this netted out. A little bit of a trick question again. The answer was no one employer type was doing everything better or doing everything well, I would say. So different employers were the best, quote unquote, to work for based on the category that was in question. And we did look across, again, 4 categories: compensation, work-life balance, clinician loyalty, and work environment. Surprisingly, corporate medical groups won on both compensation and work-life balance, while independent practices saw a spike in responses relative to clinician loyalty and work environment. Hospitals and health systems were pretty middle of the board, or really towards the bottom of the responses in all 4 of these categories. I'm going to dig into each one of these and show you how we not only calculated these, but looked at the stratification across these employer groups and how our clinicians responded on each individually. So starting with compensation, what I would say is for each of these categories that we observed, we chose 3 representative metrics that we felt were the best representation of the category overall. So in the case of compensation, we looked at overall compensation, compensation relative to the amount of work that is performed, and then non-compensation benefits as a factor here as well. And as you look across each of these 3 metrics that we observed, you'll see that corporate medical groups led on 2 of the 3, but we're actually dead last on non-compensation benefits. Now, we know from earlier that compensation is the top priority and that employers can effectively compete in other areas, including benefits. So what we would say looking at this is if you are an organization that is competing with a corporate medical group, where your best bet is in terms of, again, putting your strategic bets on where to compete is in that non-compensation benefit category. Not only do corporate medical groups lag in this category, but if you look across the response rate in all of our employer types, no one's really doing this well. And so there's a great opportunity for an employer to come out and really differentiate in this space and sort of take the lead on this metric to get at least be above the 50% threshold. I think that's sort of the next target that organizations should be shooting for is really stratifying themselves and being successful in this non-compensation benefit space to help mitigate where it may be more challenging to compete with corporate-owned medical groups in the compensation components. The second category was in work-life balance. A little surprising here, again, corporate medical groups were also the winner in this category. But what I would say is that their lead was less definitive in this space. So one thing I'll point out is as we look at the three metrics we used here, organization effectively promotes work-life balance for clinicians. The schedule allows enough time for personal and family life, and I'm able to take adequate breaks throughout the day. On at least this first metric, again, no one segment surpassed the 50% mark. So again, I think this category around work-life balance is somewhat up for grabs with clinicians. In the other two categories, the corporate-owned medical groups were only slightly above hospitals and health systems and independent practices in terms of the response rate. So I think this one it's fair to say that while corporate medical groups ultimately netted at the top, this is really anyone's game, and there's a lot to be potentially won and differentiated in the space in the market as well. So as you're thinking again about where you put your strategic priorities, this is a good category where you could do some pretty easy immediate things to try and help set yourself apart from some of the competitors in your market that may be competing for the same clinicians. The next category was in clinician loyalty. And again, this is really trying to dig deeper into that intent to leave and where we saw clinicians wanting to stay with their current employers versus considering alternative career opportunities. So this is the space where we did see independent medical groups kind of stand out from the rest of the pack in terms of the response rates. They had the highest NPS and lowest intent to leave compared to the other employer types. I want to double click on that middle metric for just a moment around where clinicians said they were potentially seeking jobs elsewhere due to compensation dissatisfaction. So if we think back to the compensation data, we saw that independent clinicians were actually the group that was most dissatisfied with current compensation. What's interesting here is that we see the inverse of that in intent to leave. So while they're most dissatisfied with their compensation, they are also reporting that they are the least likely to leave based on compensation alone. So I think that's something important to dig into, especially for folks that are working in independent practice. There's likely something else that is retaining your clinicians or preventing them from leaving the organization, and it's not the compensation that they're receiving. It may be something along the lines of the clinical autonomy or just the close-knit community that often comes with working in a smaller practice. So again, as you're going out and having conversations around your employer value proposition and where you can truly differentiate and better understand what's motivating your clinicians to stay, I would dig into this a little bit more and try to understand the dynamics around compensation and what else beyond that is really appealing to your clinicians in this practice setting. And then finally, in the work-life environment category, again, independent medical groups took the lead across all three of the metrics that we observed. So the job values align with personal values, job handles grievances effectively, and I'm comfortable bringing my whole self to work. Again, I think this correlates with some of the things that we just see around the typical size of some of these organizations. Independent practices tend to be smaller as we compare that to corporate-owned medical groups or hospitals and health systems, and it's often that close-knit community that helps contribute to some of these factors. So again, as you're thinking about your employer value proposition, especially for our independent practices, I think this is something to laud or promote about yourself. Really that community feel and the perspective that these organizations do provide a greater work-life balance. The last data point that I'm going to share with you all today, I promise you we did not seed with the intent of promoting ourselves as a staffing agency. It was just something that we asked out of curiosity as we were trying to better understand where we are providing strategic value to some of the clinicians who are seeking new job opportunities. But we did ask our clinicians whether they worked with a staffing firm to find their latest opportunity, and then looked at the correlation between whether somebody was using a staffing firm with their job satisfaction. And what was interesting is that we found that of the clinicians who worked with a agency to find their next opportunity, 14% of them, it was a higher, 14% higher response rate in terms of job satisfaction. So, working with an agency ultimately led clinicians to a job where they reported higher satisfaction across the board. And that was, again, across age demographics, across physicians versus APPs, and 1099 versus W-2s. So I think it's an important call out to say it's not just about where you go to work, but sometimes how you got there. If you're using a staffing firm, you may feel more consistently positive about where you landed. With I think the one caveat being here, I feel supported by my colleagues. Could be a potential opportunity where staffing firms have a little bit more opportunity for improvement in helping a new individual get oriented to the organization that they're going to work for and helping to bridge some of that networking opportunity as they're coming on site. But I hope that this speaks to the evolving role of staffing firms. We really aren't in the position of just filling vacancies anymore. We really should be operating as a strategic partner to employers in really finding the clinicians that are a best fit for their organization and helping them get effectively established within that organization so that we continue to see high job satisfaction as a result of that partnership. Um, so key takeaway from this section, really just call out here, don't focus only on the competitors within your same segment. If you're an independent practice, you should be looking at the organizations that are competing for talent, not only other independent groups, but looking at corporate-owned medical groups, looking at hospitals and health systems in your market, and really trying to understand the strengths and weaknesses of some of those competitors so that you can effectively come up with your own EVP that attracts and retains talent in a way that's going to be effective and sustainable for your organization. And I'll send this out. This is essentially a recap of those three major findings that we have covered today. So you all will have this as a reference point. I'm recognizing that we've only got a few minutes left, so I did want to open it up for Q&A. So Daniel, I'll turn it back to you and see if we have any questions in the chat.
We sure do. Hope, yeah, can
Awesome.
you hear me okay?
Yep, I
Yeah.
can.
Okay, perfect. Great job, Allison, as
Thank you.
always. Yeah, great information. So much commentary going on in the chat and in the Q&A, so let's get to what we can. Um, Brandon Lish is asking, Allison, good presentation. It seems like many providers are seeking the mercenary rates or high PRN 1099 rates to supplement their compensation. As you noted, providers want more compensation and Medicare paying less and pressures own compensation. With all that said, how do you see this playing out for medical group practices?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think there is going to be a certain period of time where we're going to have to come to the table and compete on compensation. But what I would say is, as I kind of alluded to in the presentation, there's a breaking point around that. You don't want to be in a race to the top for salary. And so rather than doubling down on just constantly increasing rates and increasing the compensation that you're offering clinicians, I would try to find ways to bring some of those other factors that you're able to offer, some of the things that we covered around schedule flexibility, work-life balance, non-compensation benefits into the conversation and present that as part of an overall compensation package. So think about how you can quantify the value of some of those other benefits and aspects that you're bringing to the table as part of the employer arrangement that you have with these potential clinicians, and try to help them understand what that ultimately means in terms of a total package rather than focusing solely on the salary or the rates that you're offering the clinician. That's going to be your best strategy in being able to come to the table and provide differentiation without continually having to drive up that paycheck.
Okay. Got a couple of questions about the non-comp side of it. So the first one
Yeah.
is, what are non-comp benefits you have seen that have really paid off by
Mhm.
physician age group? And then also, what are some of the non-comp benefits that seem to be of high value? And I can go back if you want to just answer the first one, and I can remind you of the second one there as well if you want.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you may have to do it.
Yeah.
So I would say in terms of non-compensation benefits, the things that I think rise to the top most frequently are again around schedule flexibility, around um, trying to find ways to provide predictability in schedules. So there are some advanced ways that I think we are starting to see organizations move further in this realm. The use of float pools, allowing clinicians to take on more differentiated employment models, maybe part-time or semi-retired, and then participating in float pools so that you have a little bit more of a dynamic and flexible workforce. Even if you're not ready to go fully down that path, there are some things that you're able to offer almost immediately in terms of schedule flexibility or predictability that we have found to be very beneficial to clinicians. It could be as simple as posting your schedules further in advance. So that clinicians have comfort in the schedule that's been assigned to them further in advance of actually having to work those hours. Providing protected schedules. So once a schedule is posted, kind of committing, we're not going to change the schedule beyond this date or this deadline, so that there's no last minute changes unless it's a case of a true emergency. That also can help clinicians feel a little bit more secure in the schedule that's been projected. Um, Also, some of the more simple things you can do, just knowing your busy periods and communicating that to clinicians more directly up front can be something that they see as a benefit. So we know we see higher patient volumes typically in the month of December or whatever it might be. It just allows your employees to proactively plan their lives around anticipated needs of the business in a more effective way that gives them greater security around the schedule without necessarily having to totally change your business model. The other thing that I would say we have seen some organizations doing is more collaborative scheduling. So, allowing clinicians to do some level of self-scheduling with guardrails. So you may give them options for shift scheduling or shifts that they are able to pick up, and then go through a negotiating process where they're given a little bit more say in the ultimate selection of the shifts that they're working. Some organizations have done this on more of like a rotational basis, like maybe I work certain shifts one week, but then I'm rotating with my peers and we're flip-flopping. Maybe I'm taking the harder shifts one week and they're taking them the next week. We've also seen some organizations implementing things like shift bidding or preference ranking. I think about this in my college sorority days. You kind of put your rank order of the shifts that you want to work, and then leveraging sort of an aggregation of all of that, you can try to match people with their topmost preferences. Again, it gives them a little bit more stake in the game. So just being able to present options like that, I think, as part of your pitch around why a clinician should come work for you has been successful for many of our clients in attracting new talent. Clinicians want to feel that they have this option available to them and that they're going to be able to have a voice in the conversation. So it's something that's fairly simple to do, and then present out to the market. I think it's just a point of making it solidified and then known to the clinicians that you're trying to bring in the fold.
Okay. Now, I had the part two of non-comp, but I feel like you
Yeah.
covered a lot of it, and I think we have,
Okay.
if you have about a minute,
Sure.
let's talk about culture.
Yeah.
Question from Todd, and there were also comments in the chat area. We have about a minute. Um, we talked about culture. What are some of the most important aspects of culture, whether it be environmental sustainability, DEI, community involvement? When y'all are doing those interviews with those younger clinicians, does anything rise up? And again, we have about a minute.
Yeah, I would actually say all of those things you just listed came up in conversations. So I think in general, at least my experience working with the clinicians who partner with us, the mission-driven values and purpose of patient care is at the heart of every clinician that I've ever met. I've never met a clinician who did not have that at the center of their practice. But I think some of those additive things that come by virtue of the employer are things that are more appealing to some of the younger demographics that are now starting to enter the market. Participation in community events, finding opportunities to maybe step out of the typical clinical setting and provide volunteer opportunities out in the community has been something that's been highlighted. I also think networking opportunities, so an opportunity to connect with peers within your organization, is something that I would tie to the cultural values of an organization. So not feeling necessarily kind of like a independent practitioner, an island within an organization, but feeling that you are part of a network of professionals who all share the same mission and vision around patient care is something that's critically important to this younger group. And the other thing I would say is good news around this is I already think this is in practice. Like this is already at the heart of most healthcare organizations in terms of how you think about ultimately what you're trying to deliver to the patients who are stepping foot within your doors. I think the shift here is in how you are communicating it and framing it in conversations with clinicians who are potentially coming to your organization. So just making some of these opportunities very visible and making them a little bit more structured in terms of how you are delivering them to your clinician workforce is probably where you have the greatest immediate opportunity to make some shifts as an organization.
All right, Allison, amazing job. We are at time, so I want to thank you and I want to thank everyone for joining us for their participation in today's program. The education for this session has ended. We would like to thank locumtenens.com for their sponsorship. Locumtenens.com provides innovative staffing solutions for healthcare clients experiencing gaps in their care continuum. Their website has a variety of digital resources for hospitals and medical practices, and their experienced associates are available to collaborate on customized approaches to solve any workforce challenge. So if you have a content question, direct those to kelly.street@locumtenens.com. If you have a webinar related question, contact ed@mgma.com. And be sure to complete the evaluation, which will be available in the learning management system 5 to 10 minutes after we sign off. After earning your certificate of completion, which is required to claim credit, please allow 24 hours for system communications. For information on all of our conferences and webinars, please see the MGMA events page. Thank you, everyone. Happy New Year. See you at another online event soon.